Next, we knew so well, elected to an unprecedented 4 terms.
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
He charted a course through the 2 greatest crises of the last century.
I have seen war, and I hate war.
Roosevelt, a man of vision, ruthlessness, and relentless drive. But there was a private side, one that FDR tried so hard to conceal. A 24-year struggle with paralysis, an affair that almost destroyed his marriage, and the loneliness that darkened his final days. Rare home movies take us into his cloistered world. A private diary kept by a cousin details his dramatic physical decline.
The president's breathing became very heavy. At that moment, the heavy breathing stopped.
After 60 years, an infinitely more complex man emerges from the shadows. They came to Washington by the thousands. Defying the blistering cold to bear witness to history. The inauguration of an American president. FDR left the White House to drive down Pennsylvania Avenue towards the Capitol. The year was 1941. After 8 tumultuous years as president, Roosevelt, with 54% of the vote, had been re-elected for an unprecedented 3rd term.
But I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
History would look kindly on the patrician that spoke the language of the dispossessed.
I share the view of almost all historians that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the greatest president of the 20th century. And beyond this, I think that the policies he adopted to deal with this terrible crisis of the Great Depression are the most imaginative, the most creative of any president in our history.
But fortunately for Roosevelt, the 1940 election had not served as a referendum on the imaginative policies of the past. The nation was still reeling from the effects of the Great Depression. Unemployment, which 8 years earlier had stood at 25%, still hovered close to 20%. FDR's victory was secured less for what he had achieved, and more as a result of his promise to keep American boys out of the fight against Adolf Hitler.
A good way of thinking about Roosevelt is, what if there was no World War? And so there was no reason for him to suddenly run for a 3rd term. He couldn't have run for a 3rd term. He would have been voted into oblivion.
Voted into oblivion because Americans were counting the cost of Roosevelt's revolution. Many insisted the president bore responsibility for expanding the reach of government beyond constitutional boundaries. His grade that winter's day was at best an incomplete. Our assessment of the president begins 9 years earlier, on the eve of his first race for the White House. America was in the depths of the greatest economic downturn in its history.
There were some commentators by 1932 who believed that they were watching the end of an historical era in which laissez-faire free market capitalism was absolutely imploding and proving its historical bankruptcy.
The evidence of decline was everywhere. 13 million Americans were out of work, millions living beyond the point of despair. Soup kitchens and squatter camps reflected the new reality. These were the worst of times. After 4 years in power, the Republican incumbent Herbert Hoover was a beaten man. He insisted that the Wall Street crash of October 1929 was a result of economic forces beyond his or anyone else's control. Not so, argued the supremely self-confident and charismatic governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, at the age of 50, was seeking the Democratic nomination for president.
And suddenly this sunburst appeared, who seemed utterly unruffled by all this. He seemed as if Americans could do anything, and he would lead them where they wanted to go, and he was going to restore hope.
Roosevelt hardly seemed a likely champion of the dispossessed. Yet in the summer of 1932, this product of privilege refused to accept that the great American experiment was doomed.
This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
In essence, Roosevelt ascended to the presidency when he accepted that nomination. In the 1932 election, he had one overwhelming advantage. He wasn't the incumbent. Roosevelt won nearly 60% of the popular vote. He accepted the affirmation of the nation from his home in Hyde Park along New York's Hudson River. For the last time, an American president would have to wait 4 months between election and taking office. Inauguration Day, Saturday, March 4th, 1933. The day opened with a service at St. John Episcopal Church in Washington. Frances Perkins, Roosevelt's selection for Labor Secretary, attended the service. She wrote in her diary, "We were in a terrible situation. If ever a man wanted to pray, that was the day. Franklin did want to pray, and he wanted everyone to pray for him." Under threatening skies and a cold northerly wind, FDR appeared supremely confident. His words reaffirmed his abiding faith in America and his determination to carry the nation back to prosperity.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
The most important thing he brought into the presidency in 1933 was this contagious confidence that he felt in himself and in his countrymen, so that even from that first speech, the inaugural speech, it's almost as if he projected his confidence onto the people, and they're saying to themselves, if he believes in us, then we believe in ourselves.
Roosevelt made it clear that he was demanding broad executive authority to reverse the ravages wrought by economic stagnation.
Roosevelt is saying to the country, you have a leader now, and you have a leader who is not afraid of exercising power. I'm willing to exercise power as though the Great Depression were a war, as though we were being invaded by a foreign foe, and I'm going to be your commander-in-chief in this war against the Depression.
The first day of his term, he was faced with the imminent collapse of the nation's banking system. Hundreds of institutions had already gone under. Thousands more stood on the brink of ruin. On the morning after the inauguration, FDR ordered the banks to close for the next 4 days in a desperate attempt to stem the tide of withdrawals. He brought bankers and politicians together, demanding that they resolve their differences and come up with a plan to solve the problem.
Roosevelt said literally to these different groups, I'm going to lock you in a room and you're not to come out till you get a solution to this. Now, that's something that presidents had never done before. This was an insistent leadership for which there is really no parallel in the past.
The presidential coercion produced an agreement. After just a single day's debate, and without waiting for a printed copy to become available, Roosevelt pushed through Congress a sweeping banking reform bill. 8 days after the inauguration, President Roosevelt went before the country to reassure the people that their savings were secure.
I can assure you that it is safer for you to keep your money in a reopened bank than to keep it under the mattress.
The reaction to the legislation went far beyond relief that savings were secure. Most Americans had long since exhausted those anyway. What FDR did in those first days was prove that action was possible, that the inertia could be broken.
The White House received in the week following that address some 400,000 unsolicited letters. The Roosevelt White House had to hire, I believe it was some 70-some-odd people to handle this stream of mail. The Hoover White House had employed exactly one person to handle that kind of unsolicited mail to the president.
The letters to Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt detailed the nation's pain, but also reflected a belief that at last something might be done.
Dear Mr. Roosevelt, I'm writing to you for help. We have 8 children to take care of, and we have a sick child.
Dear Mrs.
Please,
Roosevelt,
Mr. Roosevelt,
every
don't
week
let
we
them
go to
sit
bed
at home.
1 or 2 days without anything to eat. My
Dear
brother and
Mr.
I go down to the
President,
railway
my
track.
daddy
to pick
has
up
been
coal
sick
feed.
all winter, and we are going to lose our home. Please help me. I will do anything in my power to pay you back.
Roosevelt knew his political honeymoon wouldn't last, that time was of the essence. During his first week in office, he had called the 73rd Congress into special session. Now he began to use the new Democratic majority in both houses to transform American society. Lifting the spirits of a downtrodden nation was his first priority. To come down firmly on the side of those seeking to repeal the 18th Amendment, mandating prohibition. On April 7, 1933, Americans' 13 years of compulsory abstinence came to an end.
That helped give a sense of exuberance, a sense that the restrictive past was over, that there was a new sense of openness in the land. Roosevelt's theme song was "Happy Days Are Here Again," and it was to the tune of "Happy Days Are Here Again" that people were raising their steins in April.
In the spring of 1933, a journalist asked how FDR was enjoying the presidency. He threw his head back and exclaimed, "I love it." In the next 100 days, FDR would leave an indelible mark on the American presidency.
FDR.
In the nation's history, a yardstick against which every succeeding president would be judged, a tidal wave of New Deal initiatives to preserve the Union. As Eleanor later pointed out, FDR knew it wouldn't last.
He felt that a great deal had to be done in those days because he knew quite well that there would come a period when Congress would not be as amenable, when people would not be as amenable. This was an opportunity which must not be missed.
The top priorities were getting Americans back to work and rescuing the rural economy from total collapse. Agriculture still accounted for 30% of the American workforce, and in the previous 3 years, farm income dropped 60%. Thousands of farmers were being forced off the land, and Roosevelt saw the seeds of a possible rural insurrection.
Many of the farmers had reached the point that they were willing to take desperate action. In the spring of 1933, during the first 100 days, farmers invaded a courthouse in Iowa and pulled the judge from the bench, took him out to a country road and came close to lynching him because he would not promise not to sign any more mortgage foreclosures.
To restore a degree of stability, Roosevelt launched the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. The AAA sought to shore up prices by requiring cuts in production. Farmers were paid to destroy their crops and slaughter tens of thousands of farm animals. But the Roosevelt agricultural policy came at a price.
The government ends up paying large landholders to actually withdraw land from production and materials from the marketplace. But that money actually doesn't trickle down to the actual workers, so that thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of farmers in the South end up actually getting robbed and cheated out of the kinds of subsidies that they deserved and had actually warranted under government policy.
Thousands of black tenant farmers found themselves without a source of income. Forced off the land, they began a migration to the cities.
The administration's commitment, and Roosevelt in particular's commitment to black Americans, is nil. The greatest concern is dealing with the emergency situation, the economic and political crisis of the Depression itself. And the consequences on black Americans are, I don't even believe, a secondary concern. They're a non-concern.
Despite the inequities, FDR's agricultural policies did restore some semblance of stability to the farm economy. The experimentation was just beginning. Through programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, Roosevelt hired unemployed youth from America's inner cities to work in the countryside. Passed through Congress on March 31st, participation in the Corps paid $1 a day. Run by the Army, the CCC was attacked from the left for being too militaristic, but by June had enrolled 250,000 young men. Along the way, Roosevelt turned the federal government into the nation's largest employer.
I hope that all over the country they're in as fine condition as the camps that I've seen today. I wish that I could take a couple of months off from the White House and come down here and live with them, because I know I'd get full of health the way they have.
Then, on June 16, 1933, the centerpiece of the New Deal, the National Industrial Recovery Act, became law after passing the Senate 58-24. It was a compendium of initiatives that would impose unprecedented federal controls on American business.
The underlying philosophy of the NRA was that we'd have a planned economy and that the inefficiencies of the old capitalistic system would be done away with, that they were luxuries that simply could not be afforded with 13 million or more unemployed, with factories running at 15 or 20% of capacity. And the question was, how did you match up America's industrial capacity with the needs of its own society and of the international markets?
That was done by introducing a total of 541 industrial codes to impose wage and price controls. Antitrust laws were scrapped to reduce cost-cutting competition that was driving manufacturers into bankruptcy. To protect a worker's rights, a minimum wage of $12 for a 40-hour week was established, along with the right of labor to bargain collectively. When the NRA passed, 250,000 people marched down Fifth Avenue in New York. It was intended to show popular support for a program designed to tame the unruly cycles of American capitalism by encouraging business and government to work together.
As a boy of 10, I was taken to that parade on Fifth Avenue, and I can still see these groups marching by as though they were medieval guilds, garment workers and other kinds of workers coming along. People went to the newly opened Radio City Music Hall. They went through to the movie. They came out of it 3 hours later. The parade was still going by. It was going by after midnight, and everywhere, even on the panties of chorus girls, were the blue eagles that were the symbols of the NRA.
FDR also orchestrated an extraordinary publicity campaign to rally the nation behind the Blue Eagle.
Things are getting better every day.
Well, Abe, it looks as though we can stop worrying about our country. President Roosevelt has it headed right again.
All it needed was a plan of action and a man with the courage to put it through.
But Roosevelt's critics insisted he had gone too far, that the NRA would destroy, not rescue, the free market economy. They tried to label him a progressive liberal, but at least for the time being, the epithets didn't stick.
A few timid people who fear progress will try to give you new and strange names for what we are doing. Sometimes they will call it fascism, and sometimes communism, and sometimes regimentation, and sometimes socialism.
But in so doing, they are trying to make very complex and theoretical something that is really very simple and very practical.
The thing that was so exciting in that first year of Roosevelt's administration was the large number of creative, imaginative people that were brought into the city.
The most influential group was from Columbia University that had been assembled during the 1932 campaign. Known as the Brains Trust, they laid out the initial blueprint for the administrative assault on the Depression. Their role diminished after the election, to be replaced not by the cabinet, but rather by a small cadre of advisors working directly for Roosevelt in the myriad of agencies that sprang out of the New Deal.
During that first 100 days, all the new agencies that Roosevelt created, all the new programs, all the new policies, these were by and large not being administered or run by the traditional cabinet-level departments.
But there were individual cabinet members who did make a significant contribution. Men like Henry Morgenthau at Treasury, Harold Ickes at Interior, and Henry Wallace at Agriculture. But the star became the Labor Secretary, Frances Perkins, the first woman ever selected to serve in the cabinet.
The best part of that early New Deal was the innovative aspects. Let's get after the problem. Let's try. Let's experiment. Even though we haven't had the experience, we aren't sure things will work. And out of that came, of course, tremendously dramatic things.
Our troubles will not be over tomorrow.
As the nation reeled under a succession of crises, the vast majority of Americans were developing a unique bond with this president. In the era before television, their image of Roosevelt was formed in large part by newsreels played to movie audiences every week before the main feature.
Something fine has occurred in this great country. You can actually see people going to work. There's a new feeling of hope, of determination in the air. It is a new march of prosperity behind the country's militant leader, the fighting president.
It was an uncritical portrait of the nation's chief executive, reflecting political goals rather than assessing presidential accomplishments. But his most significant dialogue with the American people came not in the nation's movie houses, but at individual homes as the country gathered around the fireside.
There are those who fail to read both science, time, and American history.
The public's image of FDR was shaped largely by his voice, reaching them through the emerging power of radio.
It is those short-sighted ones, not labor, who threaten this country.
The addresses appeared informal and conversational. That was deceptive. Each address required days of intense work, with the president taking the lead. They were broadcast on Sunday evenings at 9 o'clock, peak listening time. During the 12 years of his presidency, Roosevelt delivered 27 fireside chats, an average of 2 or 3 a year. His secretary, Grace Tully, later recalled the ritual that preceded each broadcast.
And he always called it, I'll just think out loud. So I'd sit beside him on a couch in his study, and he would think out loud, and I'd take it down. Sometimes thinking out loud went for about 10 pages, you know. But this was something for the boys to put their teeth into, the way he expressed it. So give it to the boys in the morning.
When he got into the room to deliver the fireside chat, he would have people sitting there so he could pretend that he was talking to people in their living rooms, making his hand and his facial gestures as if he were talking live to an audience. And then he even noticed that there was a separation between his 2 front teeth and that it made a whistling sound sometimes, which he didn't like. So he had a removable bridge made just for his fireside chats.
I am happy to speak to you from my home on a Sabbath day that has been observed in so many of your home communities as Brotherhood Day.
Here in Washington, for instance, nobody would go out, or they'd invite somebody in, but they wouldn't go someplace where they didn't think that they were going to listen to the president. Now, even I think his enemies listened to him, didn't like him, didn't agree with anything he had to say, criticized him all the time, but they wouldn't miss a speech.
You could walk down the street on a hot Chicago night and not miss a single word of what he was saying on his fireside chat, because you could just follow it from house to house to house.
It was the first time Americans felt a personal connection with their president, but FDR ensured that it only went so far. The man that so touched the common people would be fiercely protective of his private self.
to meet the man who
was a detachment to Franklin Roosevelt. Even those who were with him day after day wondered what he was really like. It was at his weekend retreats in Hyde Park where he could completely relax. Weekends off limits to the press. It was a time they would act up for the camera, show a side of the family the country would never be allowed to observe. These films, taken by Marion Dickerman, a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, give us an unprecedented glimpse into the private world of the nation's 32nd president. There was the eternal optimism and good cheer, the playfulness that became infectious.
Mighty good of you to come down here. I can't be truthful and say that I'm glad to get back. I'm awfully sorry to get back. But while I've been having a wonderful time, I gather also that both houses of Congress have been having a wonderful time.
My earliest memories of my grandmother and grandfather, particularly of my grandfather, is his laughter and the times he was relaxing. And we would all go over to have a swim at Valkill and play in the pool. And I was a little afraid, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, because he dunked you. He loved to play games, and he liked to be silly. He could be silly. He enjoyed being silly. And we would go riding with him in the Ford, which he would steer with the hand controls. He drove quite fast. In fact, my grandmother called him really a very poor driver. He had fun. And I remember his fun. Being with him was fun. And I could sense my mother was exhilarated and being part of that whole scene. And people around, it was just full of laughter and gaiety and a good time.
But there was another side, a contrasting side, one that desired seclusion. For the man that projected congeniality and vigor, there were times when he would sit alone for hours with his stamp collection or playing a game of solitaire.
Ever since Roosevelt was a young child, in order to protect himself from his overbearing mother, he had to hide his real feelings from her, and it then became almost a habit that the rest of his life he kept his true feelings inside. Probably the pain of polio made that even more important for him, not wanting anyone to know how deeply hurt he was at the loss of his body. And it became, unfortunately, a difficult situation for him to ever change.
Presidents usually parade their triumphs over adversity. Roosevelt was the exception. His daily battle against the effects of paralysis was conducted in private. Few would know the toll it was taking. But it was the one burden that never went away.
Small things, like when he was going from the Oval Office back to the White House in his wheelchair. And he might be raising, telling a story and waving his cigarette, etc. The other hand was holding firmly onto the wheelchair, because if he didn't have the buttocks muscles to hold himself on it. He could rock off.
For over 10 years, since the onset of polio, every hour of every day had been affected by this incapacity. To understand Roosevelt the president, it is important to take a journey into his past, to chart a personal odyssey of courage and triumph over adversity. It was a journey FDR took himself in the summer of 1933. On June 29th, the president left Washington, sailing into open waters, heading north toward his summer home on Campobello Island off the coast of Nova Scotia.
Grab your coat and get your hat. Leave your worries back on the doorstep. Yes, direct your feet to the sunny side of the street.
Only his most inner circle knew this was the place he had been avoiding for 12 years, avoiding the memories of the summer of 1921, when he arrived a vigorous man of 39 and left a cripple. The holiday that year started like any other, an idyllic time where the summer days lingered and memories were shaped by the winds and the tides.
I enjoyed the Campbell of life. I loved the picnics. I loved sailing to different places. You would always find new places to sail to. There were so many places you could explore and go to. My husband loved it. He was a wonderful sailor. He knew the whole coast intimately.
On the sunny side of the street.
FDR's nightmare began with a simple chill the family attributed to a late afternoon swim.
And in his wet bathing suit, Franklin sat with the mail which had come while they were out. And after a very short time, it was getting near to supper time, he started to go upstairs and said his back ached and didn't feel very well. I suggested that he'd go to bed and I would bring him his supper. And that was really the beginning of his illness. By the next morning, he could hardly stand, and by the next day, he could not stand at all.
For 2 days, Roosevelt stayed in his room as the paralysis continued to spread from his legs to his hips, his chest, his arms, and his shoulders. FDR was in excruciating pain, but the local doctor wasn't sure why. He told Eleanor to relieve the discomfort by rubbing her husband's sore limbs.
With polio, every nerve cell in your body is inflamed. It's not a matter of losing sensation. It's a matter of having acute sensation. So by massaging his muscles, she was forcing them to exercise at the time when they were terribly sick. And she may, in fact, have hastened the paralysis by doing that.
Dr. Robert Lovett, a specialist in infantile paralysis, was called in from Boston. He immediately diagnosed polio.
He lay very quiet after Dr. Lovett left and seemed to be facing what this meant. He never said anything at all.
All his life, FDR idolized his distant cousin Teddy, dreamed that someday he would follow his hero into the White House. But as he lay in his room at Campobello, such thoughts appeared perverse reflections on what might have been.
You have to recognize that polio in those days carried a social stigma, like a venereal disease. People were put away when they had polio. And so to find your husband, your father, with polio must have been a huge shock to the family.
Returning to Hyde Park, he refused to accept that the paralysis might be permanent. Recovery was just a matter of time and patience. He hoped to find both here, at his home alongside the Hudson River.
He would spend a good part of the day with his braces on and his crutches, trying to walk all the way to the end of the driveway.
And he would drag himself along and back and forth, sweating buckets. I mean, it was not just an impossible task, you know, in terms of muscles, but it was painful. And the sad thing, and to me, I don't know how he put up with it, is to recognize that he was not making any progress through all of the physical therapy that he was engaging in.
Eleanor watched Franklin day after day as he tried and failed to reach the end of the driveway. It was, she said, a trial by fire. His strength and his natural optimism seemed to be on the wane.
He had said to her just once, "I'm a useless person, and I'll always be a burden."
For the first time in his life, FDR was experiencing serious depression. He would now have to confront his own demons. In the winter of 1924, FDR purchased a 71-foot houseboat he christened the LaRuco. He sailed her around the Florida Keys for months with his secretary and companion, Marguerite LeHand, known to everyone as Missy. It was a time to reflect on what he had lost. Polio had stopped a promising political career in its tracks. In 1910, Roosevelt had been elected to the New York State Senate. Then, in April 1913, President Woodrow Wilson selected him to become an Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Finally, in 1920, he ran unsuccessfully as his party's vice presidential candidate. Now, with Missy at his side, he faced the greatest obstacle of his life. Meanwhile, Eleanor remained in New York with their 5 children, aged 8 to 18. But she told friends he needed to find some way of returning to the political arena. "I don't want him forgotten," she said. "I want him to have a voice." But Roosevelt believed he could never return to elected office in a wheelchair, or while he remained on crutches. Then he was told about the Warm Springs Resort in Georgia that appeared to offer the possibility of a cure.
It's the size of a small building.
In the shadow of Pine Mountain, Georgia, the town of Warm Springs had long been a retreat for the rich, taking advantage of the waters that bubble up at a constant 88 degrees. Although never possessing medicinal properties, the open-air pools were an ideal retreat for hundreds of polios, able to exercise for hours in the warm water. Disability was a given. Everyone had a cross to bear.
He was surrounded by fellow polios, and he didn't have to pretend with them. He always used a wheelchair. He was very active socially. He had a good time. There were occasions when he'd drive to a party in one of the cottages and no one was around to carry him in. He could bounce down to the ground and with his hands bounce his butt along to get into the cottage, and he didn't think a thing about it. That's why he kept going to Warm Springs.
Roosevelt built a home at Warm Springs, but the children rarely visited their father, and Eleanor, disliking the segregated South, came infrequently and didn't stay long. It was Missy who remained with Franklin for the weeks that turned into years. This was a million miles from his world along the Hudson River. He would often drive away from Warm Springs, travel the byways of Georgia, and encounter an America he had never known before. The rural white underclass fighting for survival. Black tenant farmers beaten down by generations of bigotry and oppression. FDR was beginning to develop empathy for the underdog.
There's no question but that polio in many ways changed him. It represented, as one of his colleagues said, a plowing up of his nature. After that, he had a greater empathy for other people who had also had an unfair hand dealt to them in life that he might not have had simply coming from that aristocratic background. He became more serious. There was a depth to him that hadn't been seen before.
At an appearance before the Democratic National Convention of 1924, he arrived on crutches and hobbled his way to the podium. As the 1928 convention approached, he felt that was no longer good enough.
He told his doctors at Warm Springs, "I'll walk without crutches. I'll walk into a room without scaring everybody half to death. I'll stand easily enough in front of people so that they'll forget I'm a cripple." It was a significant effort.
It was an effort measured not in months, but in years. Along the way, he withdrew a significant portion of his trust fund to purchase Warm Springs for more than $200,000. Eleanor feared he was building a life in Georgia that excluded her and their 5 children. But he was insistent and quickly turned the facility into one of the nation's foremost centers for rehabilitation. He stayed for months at a time, acting as the Institute's unofficial physiotherapist. It remains one of his greatest and perhaps least known achievements. Appreciated by those like Hugh Gallagher, who, after getting polio at 17, went to the Institute for rehabilitation.
Everybody laughed at Warm Springs. We were not sick. We were not patients. We were people who were learning how to use the muscles we had. We had much peer support, much support from the older polios who had learned, and all of this was Roosevelt. This was the Roosevelt spirit.
It was a place where patients were encouraged to set goals and try for the impossible.
He developed what I guess you would call the illusion of walking at Warm Springs very deliberately over months and months of hard work in the Georgia sun, in which he walked from his shoulders, heaved one side of the body forward and then the other side, while resting one hand on a cane and gripping the arm of the strongest person he could find on the other, and throwing his head around and laughing and smiling and winking and shouting greetings to people as if he were having the most wonderful time in the world. He was not having the most wonderful time in the world. It was terribly difficult, terribly hard work, and constantly haunted by the fear that one of those braces would snap or the person on his arm would trip, and he would be exposed to the public.
I want to extend to the people of the state of New York.
The illusion of mobility allowed Roosevelt to avoid awkward questions about his health. But it was his progressive message that carried him into the New York governorship in 1928, and then, 4 years later, into a race for the presidency of the United States. In the fall of 1932, the Roosevelt Special traveled across the Plains states into the West. Few realized that every appearance was a carefully choreographed illusion.
He gave speeches at little towns, and at every town he had to put on his braces, and to do that you have to take off your pants, put on the braces, put his pants back on, stand him up, and he'd, leaning on the door, he'd step out on the platform and speak to the crowd.
The podium had to be bolted to the floor because the entire time he was speaking, he was really holding himself up with one arm. Sometimes he would gesture with the other one, but then he'd go back and grab the podium.
And there are pictures of him entering the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, going the length of a room crowded with people, and they go slowly so that Roosevelt can chat with the people along the way, and so that James can say hello. And James said he would FDR would grasp his son's arm so fiercely that James would want to call out in pain. But FDR told James, we're enjoying this. And, let everyone see that we're happy.
People must have been sort of willing to be deceived to some extent. And it is a deception, but without it, we wouldn't have had Franklin Roosevelt. And we need to.
It seems amazing today, but the public was never told that the president was paralyzed. Indeed, the press became willing partners in the subterfuge. They could see him in the White House being lifted into his wheelchair, saw the occasional pained expression as he tried to walk. But in the 12 years he served as president, they never wrote about or filmed his discomfort. Of the 35,000 still pictures in the Roosevelt Presidential Library, only 2 show him in a wheelchair, both taken by a cousin he trusted and not published in his lifetime. Clues to his disability can be found here at his home in New York. As a child, Franklin watched an ant burn to death in an accident involving an oil lamp. Now he installed a hand pulley elevator at Hyde Park, a way of escaping the second floor in the event of a fire. He carried that fear with him into the presidency.
He was terrified at the idea that in the White House he might be in his bedroom alone and there would be a fire and he couldn't get out. And even though everyone told him he'd hardly ever be alone, he never wanted his bedroom door locked. And he used to practice this incredible thing where he would drop from his bed onto the floor and then practice crawling to the door in case he had to get out in the case of a fire.
It was a problem going to the bathroom. Because what do? Get out of the chair, into the wheelchair, and so forth. Quite often in the Oval Office, FDR's valet brought him a bottle. Now, you don't live with this kind of making do in the way that other people are not faced with, without being totally aware of your infirmity.
The intense security surrounding the president eased his burden and meant that even at the end of his life, the vast majority of Americans still didn't know he was paralyzed.
Once he became president, he had the Secret Service. And if you're going to use a wheelchair, there's nothing better than having the Secret Service going ahead and smoothing everything out. Once at the funeral of Speaker of the House Bankhead down in Alabama, Secret Service raised the level of the street that the church was on so that Roosevelt could drive up in his limo and get out on a level and with his toddle walk enter the church.
For a time, the illusion of mobility matched the level of genuine progressive reform. FDR further expanded his control over the political agenda with sweeping gains in the 1934 midterm election. The Democrats emerged with a record 69 seats in the Senate. The Republicans in the House dropped to just 103 seats, the smallest percentage in their history. But to ensure continued cooperation from the Congress, Roosevelt traveled to Atlanta, Georgia in 1935 to preserve his support among Southern Democrats. It was a presidential charm offensive that would carry a heavy price.
FDR.
Often during his presidency, FDR would retreat to Warm Springs, Georgia, deep in the heart of the old Confederacy. This was a region that fiercely protected its way of life, and that included segregation. For a Northern aristocrat like Roosevelt, it was a time to forge a link with a core constituency within his own Democratic Party.
His long years in Warm Springs gave Southern congressmen who controlled many of the key chairmanships in both houses of Congress a feeling that Roosevelt was at least an adopted Southerner, and this was somebody that they could trust, and he knew how to sweet-talk them.
An unspoken condition of that cooperation was that Roosevelt would not challenge the South on the issue of race.
His demeanor is the demeanor of a man who's particularly comfortable with the culture of Jim Crow in the South and the racial civilization of the South, the racial inequality of the South.
Many around the president, including his wife Eleanor, felt the Southern system of segregation was morally indefensible. Yet FDR knew that attacking the underpinnings of Southern society would bring his domestic agenda to a crashing halt.
It's hard to argue that Roosevelt doesn't understand what exactly it is that Southern Democrats represent in the 1930s. And when Roosevelt speaks in behalf of states' rights and calls himself an adopted son of Georgia, he's made a very bold statement about where he stands politically, and I would think where he stands morally.
Whatever his private attitude towards segregation, FDR was unwilling to tie his presidency to a noble, lost cause. This was a president who relished political victories, and that required coalition building with the bastions of segregation. By the third year of the Roosevelt presidency, it was a strategy that appeared to be working. FDR had clear and tangible achievements to confound his critics. Programs that in 1935 culminated in passage of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA.
It was the largest single appropriation in peacetime in the history of any country in the history of the world. And it succeeded, along with other public works programs, in changing the face of America.
Under the Works Progress Administration, men and women hired by the government were building more than 5,000 schools, 2,500 hospitals, 1,000 airstrips, and 13,000 playgrounds, all at a cost of over $5 billion. Yet each day, thousands of people were being forced out of private sector jobs, and unemployment still stood at more than 15%.
He was a political genius, but he knew almost nothing about how to revive private sector activity and employment, which surely should have been the top priority in the Great Depression, which was the most important economic event in American history. They are restricting output after the country had already gone through a catastrophic contraction. So right there, it's inconceivable that you could have private sector recovery if there is less production.
Labor unrest was resulting in violent protests and strikes across the country.
The change was very much the way people felt when they were very ill. They were pleased to see the doctor. But when they began to be well again, they wanted to throw the crutches at the doctor.
Roosevelt found himself both idealized and demonized, but few would know the impact the office was having on a sensitive and immensely private man. In the spring of 1936, his closest aide, an exhausted Louis Howe, contracted pneumonia and died. That loss left Roosevelt with few intimates to lighten the load.
He had, I think it is fair to say, no truly close friend. He was not someone, for all of his charm and bonhomie, someone you easily got close to.
Roosevelt shared his secrets sparingly, and always with a few family and friends he knew he could trust. But one person to whom he was particularly close was his distant cousin, Daisy Suckley, the soul of discretion. For much of his presidency, she was happy to live in the shadows of Roosevelt's life, and was at his side when he died. For the next 45 years, Daisy lived out a solitary life here at Wilderstein, her home on the Hudson 10 miles from Hyde Park. When asked, she insisted she wasn't the kind of person who would dream of keeping a diary. But after Daisy's death, a suitcase was found under her bed. It contained many letters from Franklin, along with a diary containing some 1,400 loose-leaf pages detailing her life with FDR.
It was an amazing experience to go through those pages. This is someone who had never told anyone that she had kept Roosevelt's letters, and she had a large sheaf of them, or kept this daily diary of her time with him, thousands of pages. There is no other intimate glimpse of him quite like it.
Daisy Suckley was among the many women in my grandfather's life, a sleeper. That is, nobody quite realized until her diary was published just how much rapport these two people had, how much they enjoyed each other's company.
The closeness and importance of this relationship is revealed in a letter FDR sent Daisy, acknowledging that public attacks made by his opponents were troubling him, but felt it was necessary to hide his frustrations from all but her. September 23rd, 1935. Do you know that you alone have known that I was a bit cast down these past weeks? I couldn't let anyone else know it, but somehow I seem to tell you all those things, and what I don't happen to tell you, you seem to know anyway. This insight may have made her more sensitive to Roosevelt's political aspirations and more eager to see him succeed. As the 1936 election approached, she confided to her diary that she had worries.
December 10th, 1935. His mother said in 33, when he was being praised to the skies, "In 6 months, he may be the most hated man in the country." She is wise. I pray he may not have to suffer that. For a cripple who can't even pace the floor of his own room. It would be just so much harder to bear.
But if Roosevelt feared rejection, he didn't show it. As the presidential campaign of 1936 moved into high gear, FDR insisted he welcomed the hatred of those who stood in his way.
Meet the man who, with this simple...
As the 1936 election approached, he launched an even more ambitious second New Deal with the ferocity usually seen on the field of battle.
Here in America, we are waging a great and successful war. It is not alone a war against want and destitution and economic demoralization. It is more than that. It is a war for the survival of democracy. And so, I accept the commission you have tendered me. I join with you. I am enlisted for the duration of the war.
He undertook a massive building program to strengthen the country's infrastructure. He promised power for rural America, where 9 out of every 10 families still lived without electricity. He pushed the Social Security Act through Congress, insisting that all Americans deserved a safety net and that seniors had the right to avoid destitution in their final years. All programs designed, he said, to ensure the survival of American capitalism.
In private, he said more than once to more than one of his associates, he said, if the capitalist class in this country only understood what I'm up to here, they would understand that I am the best friend they've ever had, because I'm reforming this system, the free enterprise system, in ways that will preserve its viability for generations to come. And if it weren't for me, there's a possibility that the forces of truly radical revolution would gather energy and overturn this system altogether. And it's only by reform that the system will survive.
But as he expanded the role of the federal government, he raised taxes to pay for it. That was too much for his wealthy friends along the Hudson River. One of his neighbors was quoted as saying, "That man in the White House has gone too far." Even his own mother balked at subsidizing FDR's most ambitious attempt at social engineering.
She and FDR had their differences. She, for example, refused to pay Social Security on the wages of people on the estate at Hyde Park. And when the Social Security Administration, embarrassed as they were to confront the President of the United States that his mother was not paying her Social Security taxes, he said, "Don't worry about it. I will pay the taxes for her, but don't you tell her."
4 years earlier, he forged a strong alliance with business leaders. They too feared the end of American capitalism. Now, as that fear receded, they became the administration's harshest critics. Roosevelt fought back with the most aggressive and negative campaign of his political career.
And we know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
His vitriolic attacks worked. He was reelected by a huge majority, losing only 2 states to Alf Landon, the moderate governor of Kansas. On January 20th, 1937, Roosevelt told the nation that the work of his New Deal was far from over.
I see 1/3 of a nation still housed, still clad, still nourished.
But then Roosevelt's charmed presidency came unstuck. FDR's skill at reading the nation's political pulse abandoned him. He started his second term on a path that would lead to spectacular failure. The greatest political miscalculation of FDR's career grew out of a day 2 years before that New Dealers would remember as Black Monday. That was May 27, 1935, when the Supreme Court struck down the very heart of Roosevelt's New Deal by nullifying the National Recovery Act. insisting that the federal government had exceeded its constitutional authority.
A showdown with the court was inevitable. At no time in our history, before or since, has the court struck down so many pieces of vital legislation. The keystones to FDR's program in the first New Deal were the NRA and the Farm Program, the AAA. The Supreme Court destroyed both.
Now, flush with electoral triumph, FDR decided to take on the nation's justices.
The Democratic administration and the Congress made a gallant, sincere effort to raise wages, to reduce hours, to abolish child labor, and to eliminate unfair trade practices. And what happened? You know who assumed the power to veto and did veto that program. I say we must act now.
FDR's legislative remedy was to propose a bill that would add a jurist for every member of the court who had reached the age of 70. He claimed he only wanted to cut down their workload. It fooled no one. For months, he traveled the country, squandering the political capital won in the 1936 election. And with each passing day, the inevitability of defeat seemed apparent to everyone except Franklin Roosevelt.
He touched a nerve in public opinion and in the Congress that was quite raw, and the backlash against his proposal to change the number of justices on the Supreme Court was extreme.
On Capitol Hill, Republican critics like Representative John O'Connor insisted Roosevelt had to be stopped.
Reorganization bills arouse people of this country as they have seldom been stirred up before. They saw in that bill the threat of a dictatorship. That is why the House of Representatives defeated that bill. People of our country want no part of a dictator.
Final rejection came in July 1937, when the president failed to get the Senate to vote on the proposal. The court-packing episode was a stinging political reversal. A reversal compounded by the results of the 1938 midterm elections, which saw huge gains for the Republican Party. Together, they marked the end of congressional willingness to expand the reach of the New Deal.
Was a terrific blow to Roosevelt's ego and to his self-confidence. Well, then came the other side of Roosevelt that isn't so beautiful, and that is his vindictive streak. And in the 1938 elections, he personally campaigned in primaries against those who had opposed the Supreme Court. It was devastating. He got beaten every time. I think he only, if I recall correctly, he only won one election in the 10 or 12 people that he tried to defeat. It was incredibly humiliating.
Compounding the president's problems in 1938 was the emergence of a demand that he use his office to press for federal legislation outlawing the most extreme manifestation of racial bigotry.
I would argue that part of saving the nation is ending the crime of lynching. I don't think he has the moral choice of deciding that the fate of some of his citizens is less significant or less important or less urgent than the needs of the others.
His policy of benign neglect was now under assault. For years, he had been able to avoid confronting the reality of lynching. No longer. Eleanor Roosevelt would take the lead in demanding the Congress federalize the crime of lynching.
It's the size of a small building.
By 1938, Eleanor Roosevelt's campaign for racial justice was the culmination of an extraordinary personal journey. She had not come easily to the role of the administration's conscience. It is a story as remarkable as her husband's battle to overcome polio. At the beginning of FDR's presidency, Eleanor dreaded the prospect of moving into the White House.
Well, Eleanor Roosevelt very much did not want to be First Lady. The thought of living in the White House filled her with the greatest sense of possible dread.
Eleanor's fears grew out of a past marked by loneliness, insecurity, and betrayal. Orphaned at 8, she spent a lonely childhood living with her maternal grandmother, Mary Ludlow Hall, at Oak Terrace, the family estate in Tivoli, New York, alongside the Hudson. As a young girl, she had been told by her family that she was unattractive and had been given the nickname Granny.
As a whole, this family had great beauty. It was an unknown thing for a hall girl not to be a belle at every party. One of the aunts was to say to me, "It is an extraordinary thing. You are the ugly duckling of the family."
She had Griselda moods, which I think were serious bouts with depression. And they didn't last long. She snapped out of it, but I think that was genuine and recurring bouts with depression.
But in her late teens, she turned the hurt into a passion for good deeds. In 1903, she volunteered at New York's Rivington Street Settlement House, helping East European refugees. She brought her distant cousin Franklin along to expose him to this alien world 100 miles from the security of Hyde Park.
I think she did it because she was overwhelmed with what she saw and wanted to share it with him. He was shocked. He had never been exposed to real poverty.
Over his mother's strong objections, she insisted they were too young, Franklin and Eleanor were married on March 17, 1905. Over the next 13 years, Eleanor stepped into the role of a traditional politician's wife as her husband moved up the political ladder. To help organize her social calendar, Eleanor hired a young woman named Lucy Page Mercer. The family soon included her in the Washington party circuit that Eleanor despised and her husband relished. Lucy was everything Eleanor was not, and Franklin was entranced.
What drew Lucy to Roosevelt was that she had enormous self-confidence. She had a charm. She was flirtatious. She was statuesque. She was beautiful. But she was warm, and she could respond to his playfulness in a way that at that point Eleanor, who had much less confidence in herself, could not.
I think FDR was bowled over by falling in love, and perhaps for the first time in his life, really head over heels in love.
Eleanor had her suspicions, but was assuaged by her husband's denials. The moment of truth came in the summer of 1918. FDR seemed distracted, anxious to have her go to their summer home in Campobello without him. When she opened his suitcase after an overseas trip, she discovered why. Inside, she found letters, evidence of her worst fear, that her husband was indeed having an affair with Lucy.
It confirmed the darkest fears she had about herself, that she could never hold on to anyone as handsome and dashing as her husband, and that it was a sort of confirmation of all the betrayals of her girlhood that she's really expected from life.
More in resignation than anger, Eleanor offered Franklin a divorce. Her mother-in-law, Sarah, horrified by the potential scandal, insisted that was out of the question. If her son left Eleanor and the children, Sarah would cut him out of the estate.
So it was then that they came to a discussion with one another that he promised he would never see Lucy again, and she, therefore, would stay with him in marriage.
Eleanor Roosevelt would stay in the marriage, but on her own terms. She would now set her own goals and find her own voice. By the time FDR was elected president in 1932, Eleanor was seen as the more progressive of the two.
She was on the board of the Women's Trade Union League, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the National Consumers League. I mean, there were 17 organizations to which Eleanor Roosevelt lent her incredible energy.
Initially, FDR wanted Eleanor to abandon her career and assume the role of White House hostess. But she quickly convinced him that she could become his roving ambassador, travel across the breadth of the nation, reporting back on conditions ordinary Americans faced during the darkest years of the Great Depression.
She created what they called the Eleanor basket, which would be right by his bed at nighttime, and she would send him in memos in which she would write out the stories that she wanted him to hear, which would then impact his policy. After a while, however, there were so many memos coming into him that he made a deal with her. Eleanor, 3 memos a night. I promise I will read them and act upon them by morning.
Eleanor Roosevelt would often travel into the Deep South. This was an alien world for the daughter of a New York aristocrat. What she found in this segregated society appalled her. She came to view race relations in America as a litmus test for the conscience of the nation. And she found that there was abundant evidence that the country was failing that test. In over 100 cases from 1933 to 1939, the Ku Klux Klan had inflicted their own perverted form of justice and retribution.
These murders included drowning, choking, stabbing, beating, torturing, maiming, skinning victims. The thousands of people gathered to watch the ritual murder of other people across the color line. They actually bought souvenirs, and the souvenirs were pieces of charred bodies.
Yet Roosevelt remained reluctant to intervene. His critics sensed a troubling detachment, evidence of a politician unwilling to expend political capital by denouncing the reality of these crimes.
I think it's conceivable that he could have lived in Georgia all those years and chosen not to be aware of what the other side of the world was like, what the other side of life in Georgia was like. But that was a choice.
But Eleanor had no hesitation in becoming involved. Appalled, she was more than ever determined to persuade FDR to press for congressional passage of an anti-lynching bill that had been stalled in the Senate for over 4 years. She took Walter White, the executive director of the NAACP, to the Oval Office to try and stir the conscience of a reluctant president.
Franklin said to him, "You go ahead, you do everything you can do. Whatever you can get done is okay with me. But I just cannot put this on my must list because I have to have the Southern votes for a rearmament." And I said to him afterwards, "Well, now what about me? Do you mind if I say what I think?" And he said, "No, certainly not. You can say anything you want. I can always say, well, that's my wife. I can't do anything about her."
FDR was reluctant to move on the race question because he knew he would be expending precious political capital on a lost cause. But when the bill finally reached the Senate floor, the First Lady's fierce advocacy stood in sharp contrast to her husband's silence.
But when he refuses to put the full pressure of the White House behind the lynching legislation, Eleanor swings into action. She not only writes about it, she, against his wishes, attends a photographic exhibit on lynching. She sits for days throughout the entire filibuster in the United States Senate as this is going on. She sits with African Americans, and the press asks her, "Mrs. Roosevelt, what are you doing?" She says, "I am bearing witness."
The anti-lynching bill was never brought to a vote. On February 21st, 1938, after a 6-week Senate filibuster, led by Southern Democrats, the White House withdrew the legislation.
A better nation, a fairer nation, and a more just nation.
But Eleanor wasn't willing to accept defeat and move on. By now, she knew the power of symbolic protest. When the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to allow the classical vocalist Marian Anderson to sing at Constitution Hall, Eleanor resigned from the organization and arranged a concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. For the 75,000 present that day, it was a clarion call to arms, the beginning of a movement that would stretch down through time from Washington to Montgomery, to Albany, Selma, Birmingham, and beyond. But domestic concerns would end up taking a back seat to international issues in 1940 during FDR's unprecedented third run for the presidency.
Meet the man who, with this simple device, could have single-handedly brought the casino in.
Franklin Roosevelt was first elected president the same year Adolf Hitler became the German chancellor. As FDR grappled with the American Depression in 1933, Hitler blamed Germany's economic woes on Jews, intellectuals, and the legacy of World War I. He insisted on restoring his nation's former greatness, whatever the cost, and regardless of the protestations of his neighbors. His bellicosity echoed across the Atlantic to an American president woefully conscious of the inadequacy of American defenses.
Roosevelt embarked on a long-term campaign of education of the American public, including the Congress, as to just how dangerous the international environment was becoming. Roosevelt knew when he embarked on this campaign that it was going to take a long time and he was going to have to proceed very slowly and very carefully.
In March of 1938, Hitler expanded the Third Reich into Austria, and 6 months later into the Sudetenland on the German border with Czechoslovakia. Then, in April 1939, Roosevelt wrote a letter to the German Chancellor. In it, he listed 31 countries and asked for assurances that Germany would not attack or invade any of them for the next 10 years. 2 weeks later, Hitler issued a scathing response in an address to the Reichstag, ridiculing Roosevelt and refusing to meet his demands.
Bulgarien, Türkei, Irak, Arabien, Syrien, Palestina, Egypt.
In June 1939, in an unprecedented show of solidarity, Roosevelt invited the King and Queen of England to visit America.
When the King and Queen of England came to see us at Hyde Park in 1939, we decided we would try to give them as much of an American entertainment as we could, and we had a picnic. The King and Queen enjoyed themselves enormously. The entertainment was given by American Indians, and as far as I know, they had a very good time. The only drawback was that the Queen found she could not eat a hot dog. Her mouth was too small.
As they prepared to leave, the president called after them, "Good luck to you. All the luck in the world." Three months later, Germany moved across the Polish border, plunging the continent into war. FDR received the news in his office at Hyde Park. It confirmed his worst fears.
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will. And I give you assurance and reassurance that every effort of your government will be directed toward that end.
In London, one man knew that continued American neutrality would ensure German hegemony over the continent of Europe. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill argued that Britain and the United States needed to forge a grand alliance to confront tyranny with force. His plea appeared to touch a responsive chord with Roosevelt.
On September 11th, 1939, he sat down and wrote a personal letter to Churchill, of course, who wasn't even prime minister at that point, offering to open a channel of communication, and almost surely understood that he couldn't stay out of the fight forever.
By writing to a member of the British cabinet instead of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, Roosevelt broke with established diplomatic etiquette. But it was a strategy that fit into the clandestine world FDR loved.
And Roosevelt, in essence, is saying, I recognize the correctness of your posture. I don't want to speak to the Prime Minister of Britain in candid ways that I'll speak to you, because this will, so to speak, be off the record. Behind the scenes. I'm really an internationalist. I'm not an isolationist. I have to appear to be an isolationist. My posture has to be that because of American domestic politics. And if I give this kind of information that I'm giving to you to the British Prime Minister, it's all the more likely to leak out and cause me all sorts of grief at home.
Both men assumed the correspondence would be confidential. They were wrong. There had been a major and potentially explosive breach of security at the American Embassy on Grosvenor Square in London. There, a young cipher clerk, Tyler Kent, was intercepting each of the top-secret messages and making copies. He intended to hand the incriminating material to Senator Arthur Vandenberg, a leader of the isolationist movement in the U.S. Senate.
Well, I think the Tyler Kent affair is one of the sort of the great unexploded bombs, if you like, of the Second World War.
For the next 6 months, Roosevelt wrote to Churchill without knowing that Kent was taking down every word. FDR now faced the greatest political decision of his life, whether to run for a third term as president. He sent clear signals that he wanted to retire to Hyde Park. He built Top Cottage, a small house on his estate that had a magnificent view of the Hudson River and the Catskill Mountains. He told friends that after the tripling of taxes and with unemployment still close to 20%, the Republicans would savage him if he decided to run again on his record.
How can you claim that you have made people better off, that you have gone 2 complete terms and you haven't brought about a recovery in the American economy from this depression? If you were running in 1940 on your record, your economic record, it's a dismal record.
That economic assessment is based on his failure to pull the nation out of the Depression. It is not the view of many historians who credit Roosevelt for advancing American society in the 1930s in a multitude of ways.
What doesn't show up on the performance indicators was the restoration of hope, and I think that's immeasurable and something that America today might be a quite different country if Roosevelt had not managed to restore America's belief in itself.
But overshadowing the past was the looming specter of a future war. FDR told party leaders he would not actively seek the Democratic nomination, but if the party felt they needed him in this time of crisis, he would find it hard to refuse a draft. Dawn on the morning of May 10th, 1940. German panzer divisions moved with lightning speed. Overrunning Denmark, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Holland. 200,000 men, 3,000 aircraft moved towards the French border. In London, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain stood before the House of Commons, his Munich Accord in shreds. There would be no peace in this time. In the name of God, go, was the call from a senior member of his own Conservative Party. Hours later, he resigned to be replaced by Winston Churchill. King George VI had chosen a man well aware of the enormity of the challenge that lay ahead.
You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory.
3,500 miles away, Franklin Roosevelt remained a mere spectator, constrained by the neutrality laws that were supported by overwhelming popular opinion. He was reduced to watching the unfolding events that revealed the level of America's impotence.
By the late 1930s, the United States military establishment, Army and Navy and the Air Forces alike, ranked probably 15th or 16th or 17th in the world, way down the list of effective military powers. So this was one known constraint that Roosevelt faced.
The American president commanded an air wing that didn't have planes, a navy without ships, and troops that fired flour bags at cardboard tanks to simulate the reality of war. Hardly a force likely to turn back a Nazi blitzkrieg. There was another far more important constraint: the preponderant will of the American people. In poll after poll, they insisted that the United States should stay out of this European war. FDR could read the polls, but also knew he had to encourage Churchill. He continued his private back channel without knowing that Tyler Kent, the cipher clerk at the American Embassy in London, was monitoring all the traffic. By the middle of May, Kent had accumulated documents detailing private assurances and shared goals that, if released, would change the course of American political history.
This would have enraged an isolationist Congress. It would have proven to the American people that what they had been saying all along was correct, that the president was not really telling the truth.
On May 20th, 1940, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was at his country home at Chartwell, 20 miles south of London. He was told that MI5, the British intelligence service, had been tracking Kent for months and believed he was about to flee the country. Churchill ordered his arrest, and that night, Tyler Kent and over 1,400 documents were seized at his home in southwest London. Had MI5 waited 24 hours, the documents would have been in the hands of the isolationist America First movement. Roosevelt's domestic critics always accused him of being duplicitous. Armed with Kent's treachery, they would have been able to argue that they had the evidence to prove it.
If Americans had known that Roosevelt was having a secret dialogue with Churchill, and that he was in any way at all assuring Churchill that we were going to be there for Britain, to shore them up, to back them up, to assure against British defeat against the Nazis, it would have defeated Roosevelt in the 1940 campaign.
3 weeks after Churchill assumed the premiership, Britain's army was poised to absorb one of the greatest military defeats in its history. Nearly 400,000 men were trapped on a beachhead at Dunkirk in France, with the Germans pressing their advantage. It appeared the British Expeditionary Force was about to be annihilated. They were saved when more than 200 British naval vessels and 800 civilian boats crossed the English Channel and picked up more than 335,000 stranded British soldiers.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
There's no question that Roosevelt was keenly aware that 80 to 90% of the country did not want to become directly involved in the war, and a strong 60 to 70% didn't even want to be selling supplies at that point, even to Britain.
This island, or a large part of it, was subjugated and starving. The new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old.
Well, the New World only meant one thing, and that was Franklin Roosevelt. Churchill was playing to an audience of one.
But then, nothing. No declaration, no American promise to deploy force. 2 weeks later, France fell, and Churchill told his cabinet that Roosevelt seemed intent to watch from the sidelines as Britain went down to defeat.
There was bitterness. I'd say there was a period where Churchill was bitter and where he would make remarks to his closest associates, such as, the Americans are very good at applauding the brave deeds of others. So there was that element.
Roosevelt felt the Prime Minister didn't understand the precarious nature of his hold on power. Whatever his private belief, he knew an overwhelming number of Americans still resisted joining in the fight. In the summer of 1940, he did take one more incremental step toward engagement. He pushed through a bill to initiate a draft, to start building an army that could fight. But Roosevelt's future was still in doubt. 1940 was an election year, and no man had ever run for a third term as president. On July 19th, FDR finally broke his silence. From his study at Hyde Park, he spoke to delegates at the Democratic Convention in Chicago.
If I am called upon to do so by the people of my country, my conscience will not let me turn my back upon a call to service.
The Republican nominee, Wendell Willkie, was a political novice from Indiana. It was his first race for elected office, and he accused Roosevelt of a secret plan to pull the United States into the fight.
He started blasting Roosevelt as a warmonger and saying, I think we should think twice about going into this war, and so forth and so forth. And Roosevelt's polls went into a nosedive. And his aides then frantically rushed to him and said, you have got to deny that you have any intention of leading the United States into the war.
In late October 1940, a week before Election Day, the president made a promise he was told he had to make, but feared he couldn't keep.
I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war.
Impulsively, he made that statement, which right away Eleanor knew was a mistake, because she said, you cannot promise something that you can't deliver on. But it was just one of those campaign things you say, and he was hurt by saying that later on. It was not his finest moment.
Roosevelt was trapped. He understood that if Britain fell, Americans would be living at the point of a gun. But defeating Hitler would almost certainly cost thousands of American lives, a price the country seemed unwilling to pay. Over the next 4 years, FDR would shake the country loose from its isolationist roots, initiate the greatest mobilization in the history of the world, and win a war that would transform the United States into a global superpower. Together, they would add up to the greatest set of challenges any president had faced since the darkest days of the Civil War.
When the world faced disaster, he refused to admit defeat. He refused to accept his handicap. FDR became America's shining light by keeping us in the dark. FDR, A Presidency Revealed, continues tonight at 9 on the History Channel.